I think that anybody who has watched this podcast with any kind of frequency really by now does know that I am a tremendous admirer of Dr. Jordan Peterson. There are definitely there's corners of the world where that's not a popular thing to say. There are all kinds of people who despise Dr. Peterson, hate him with just about every fiber of their being, and you can't really have conversations about this topic with these people. At least you can't really expect them to engage honestly or in good faith. They are basically out to trash him no matter what they have to say or do in order to do it, no matter basically whatever they have to take out of context in order to do so. And so recently there was, I'm trying to think of how you would describe it. Certainly not an interview, more like a dialogue that was posted online between Dr. Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, famously, he's one of the, did you say famously or infamously? But he describes himself as one of the four horsemen of atheism, which I have talked about on this podcast before. Just to kind of rehash it, reiterate it. If you describe yourself as one of the four horsemen of anything and you're not in a heavy metal band, then you're probably a tremendous douchebag. Just a tumbling dickweed of a human being, which at the very least at the time that he proclaimed himself one of the four horsemen of atheism, definitely Richard Dawkins was. And so, of course, unfortunately, he was not the only one. There was, who were the other three? There was Sam Harris. I believe that there was Christopher Hitchens, and then there was some vanilla midget. It was just kind of there, basically, like the one guy in the room that was not really like a name brand, like a recognizable name, anything. Just the fourth guy, like the Paul Roma of the actual Four Horsemen, like the Steve Mongo McMichael, of the WCW Four Horsemen. It's not really a thing that I take seriously. But Richard Dawkins is an individual who, over the last few years, has kind of taken a very interesting shift. While there were people in that whole atheist movement that were trying to drag it, in this woke, intersectional direction, Richard Dawkins, he has become an outspoken critic of that sort of thing. And so when somebody decided to put him and Dr. Peterson together in the same room to have a conversation, there was actually that just kind of gave them a common ground for the two of them to meet on and begin this conversation. And overall, it was a pretty fascinating conversation. But at a certain point, it felt like Richard Dawkins, he kind of lost track of what the conversation had been about from the very beginning, from its very inception. And if you sit down and you watch this thing, and it's literally there in the title, it's about archetypes and memes. And so basically, when you're talking about archetypes and memes, and particularly if you are listening to Jordan Peterson talk about archetypes and memes, it means that, archetypes and memes, it means that basically you're going to hear a lot about Carl Jung. And so Carl Jung, for anybody who might not be familiar with him, he's an old German psychologist. And he was the one that kind of came forward with this theory that, various cultures, they share these common archetypes, like these common character types in their stories that they share. And we kind of have a lot of these in common because they represent things that are deeply ingrained in human biology, like basically in human psychology at the biological level. These things, they develop similarly, not necessarily identically, across numerous different cultures because they represent, they are representations of things that are basically in the deeply ingrained into the primal human mind. And so that was what Dr. Peterson had been talking the whole time. And there's just a one point where it felt like, Richard Dawkins, he had kind of lost track of this. And he starts to make fun of Jordan Peterson for talking about, quote unquote, the biology of a dragon. And so Jordan Peterson, he's talking about, the idea of a dragon as being like the archetypical predator. It represents so many different things that the amygdala of the human brain, is constantly on the look for. And so kind of to describe it most simply, the amygdala is basically, it's the part of your brain that keeps that keeps your attention alert for the presence of threats. Literally the way that Dr. Peterson describes it, and I think this is a great description, he says it's the part of your brain that just keeps looking for snakes. And so whenever you see like an area where basically like a predator could be hiding, it's like your brain kind of focuses in on that, and you get a little bit anxious, and you're like, is there, there's a part of your brain that subconsciously is basically saying, it's like, oh, well, is there a snake in there? Basically just looking for predators. And so Dr. Peterson, he's basically talking about a dragon as kind of a concept that is created by this particular part of the human brain that obviously every human has, because we all pretty much do have like the same brain on a functional level. On like a biologically functional level, pretty much all humans have the same, kind of a brain. Basically it's just like a concept of pretty much like the ultimate predator, like a giant snake with wings that breathes fire. According to Jungian psychology, concepts like that are kind of born out of this very basic functioning of the human mind, this primal functioning of the human mind. Something that I think that a lot of people would like to honestly believe that they have just kind of, we have completely evolved beyond. But the fact is that as long as the human brain is the way that it has evolved, it's always like that, like it's something that has always been there. It is there now, and it will always be there. And so when Dr. Peterson talks about the biology of a dragon, he is not talking about like literally the biology of a dragon that actually exists in the real world. He's talking about the biological part of the human brain that has created this archetype. And of course, there were, unfortunately, that's something like that. It does attract attention of the people who either, well, I think most likely probably didn't really understand the context of it, because they probably weren't even really listening to the conversation. They were just looking for something that they could clip to try to make Dr. Peterson look like a buffoon. And there were people that, of course, once that whole thing was clipped out of context and put out there, there were people that were on the internet journaling, but Dr. Peterson thinks the dragons are real. No, that's not what he said. It's not even what Joe Rogan said. When he was talking about whatever it was that he said that got that doofus from The View, to refer to him as like a dragon believer. He didn't actually say that he believes in dragons. He just kind of believed in the plausibility of something like that. He actually gave like a really interesting sort of description of the way that something like that could actually be plausible. And you know what? It actually did make sense in a certain view. Now, okay. Obviously, dragons are not real. Obviously, dragons are, they're not really real, man. Maybe they could have been, but they're not. They're not really real. Okay, Joe Rogan knows that. Dr. Jordan Peterson, he knows that. That's not actually what they're talking about. But there were all kinds of people, once this clip was out there, they couldn't accept any explanation that pointed anywhere other than like, oh, they actually believe this thing. Despite the fact that literally the first section of the interview clearly establishes that they were not talking about real things. They're not talking about like really real things, man. They're talking about like, they're talking about basically products of the human imagination driven by primal parts of the human brain. That's what they were actually talking about. It's explained in literally the first part of the conversation. But then you get all kinds of people that just kind of like belly up to this bar, and they're thinking to themselves, yeah, ooh, this is my moment. I get to make Dr. Peterson look stupid. And then some of them come out of the woodworks, in their frenzy to do this. And they say things that themselves are, like extremely ignorant or just plain stupid. There was one individual that I was explaining this to, and he had the temerity to say to me, it's like, oh, well, I know what Jungian psychology is. I know what that is. And I don't think that he wrote very much about dragons. I don't think he wrote anything about dragons. I'd like to see a source, explaining how Jung talked about dragons. Carl Jung wrote extensively about dragons. So I dropped a link to a York University study, basically kind of just like outlining, Carl Jung's history of writing about dragons as an archetype, and that dude disappeared. As you would. If you had kind of hung your balls out to be kicked like that, and then somebody actually, gives you a good one, yeah, it would be the smart time to go away. Some people were very persistent after having said some extremely stupid things. There was a woman from Australia whose profile actually identified herself as an actual professional credentialed therapist who actually disagreed with the statement, fire kills you. He's like, oh, he says fire kills you. No, it doesn't. It's like, there's a word that I would like to use to describe what you just said that would probably get me penalized by the YouTube algorithm. Starts with an R, ends with a D. Take a guess at the word that I would use to describe the thing that you just said. And you would not believe it. You would think it impossible that somebody who would try to describe themselves as an intelligent person, let alone somebody trying to portray themselves as more intelligent than Dr. Jordan Peterson, who I remind you all has taught at Harvard. He has taught at Harvard. And these people want to try to convince people that they're smarter than him, or at least that he's dumber than them. Which, I'm sorry, if you're disagreeing with the statement that fire kills you, you are not, nobody is dumber than you at that point. Like, you are literally, it's like, we might as well, we might as well just graft that dunce cap onto your skull, and you can just pretend like you're an extra when you were an extra in Coneheads or something. As far as I'm concerned, you are an absolute dolt. You sit there being like, "Oh, he said fire kills you." Fine, no, it doesn't. Go get trapped in a fire. Go get trapped in a fire and tell me how that works out for you. You fucking idiot. And as it actually just so happens, but the same part of the brain that I spoke about before, the amygdala, the part that actually actively scans the world around you for snakes, actually responds to fire pretty similarly to the way that it responds to snakes. And of course, I don't think that it can actually be denied that the human brain, it does respond to controlled fire a little bit differently than it responds to uncontrolled fire. But then again, the amygdala also responds to a snake in captivity a little bit differently than it responds to a snake in the wild. I mean, one thing that Dr. Peterson did say is that, it's all very complicated. When you're trying to unravel, when you're trying to unravel, One thing that Dr. Peterson did say is that it's all very complicated. And yeah, when you're trying to unravel, the deepest inner workings of the human brain, yeah, that's all very complicated. So complicated, in fact, that, there are some people that are not even prepared to, they're not even prepared, to address psychology as a science. Over the last 2 years, I've actually had two different people try to tell me that, like, the science of psychology is fake. At which point I've just had to like shut these conversations down cold and be like, no, psychology is real. Your brain functions. It's chemicals and electricity. That's real. Those things are real. It's a goddamn stupid thing to say, but some people say it. And all sorts of people that would come to you and tell you that they're intelligent people say all kinds of incredibly stupid things. It seems like, including particularly, the people that want you to believe that Dr. Jordan Peterson is some kind of an idiot. And they'll do all kinds of dirty and underhanded and sneaky things in order to try to make other people think that. Because these are people who honestly think that underhandedness and sneakiness, they're signifiers of cleverness and intelligence. Unfortunately, that's kind of the low kind of level that these people's egos function at. But really, for the most part, these are people who are not to be taken seriously. And I think that you will find that if you isolate them and you put them in a corner with the kind of context that they are deliberately trying to remove from whatever it is they're trying to present, you will very quickly find that no, these are not people to be taken seriously, and really they are not capable of conducting themselves as if they were people who should be taken seriously. You stick them in a corner with that bit of context that they are deliberately trying to remove, and they absolutely melt. And they're sitting there, they're blathering things like, "Oh, fire doesn't kill you." Yeah, I just said the word. I think I just said the word that's going to get me penalized by the algorithm. Oh, okay. Fuck it. Who cares? I mean, I guess if the shoe fits, then you got to wear it. And if it fits Cinderella, then you just got to jam her foot right into that glass slipper. So in conclusion, just as a quick unsolicited plug, Dr. Peterson's new book, We Who Wrestle with God, or is it Those of Us Who Wrestle with God? His new book is out now. I do have it. I will let you know what I probably will say something about it, what I think about it as I finish it. But man, I think I'm going to be a little wild with this one. So please, by all means, do not hold your breath.